In the shadow of the pyramids, where the vast desert stretches endlessly beneath the blazing sun, there are secrets that have been buried for millennia, hidden in the sand and silence. The grand tombs of Egypt, once shining symbols of the pharaoh's power and divinity, now lie as silent sentinels. Their walls etched with hieroglyphs that tell stories of unimaginable wealth, untold power, and dark rituals. But these stories are not the ones sung by the bards or celebrated in the grand temples. These are the hidden truths. The rituals that took place in the darkest corners of the ancient world, the truths that the pharaohs themselves fought to keep concealed. For every gold mask, every sacred artifact, there was a price, one that the pharaohs were willing to pay, but one that would forever tie their souls to the underworld. The legend of the pharaohs begins with their extraordinary beliefs in the afterlife. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transition, a journey from the physical world to the realm of the gods. But this journey, though divinely ordained, was fraught with peril. To ensure a safe passage, pharaohs called upon the powers of the gods, the forces of the underworld, and the ancient rituals that had been passed down from the earliest dynasties. But the truth behind these rituals is far more chilling than any myth. At the heart of every great tomb, beyond the treasures and the mummified remains, there was one sacred object, the tomb's ceremonial door. This door, often adorned with the finest gold and jewels, wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a symbolic threshold, a final boundary between life and death. It was said that the pharaoh's soul, once entombed, would pass through this door, entering the halls of the afterlife. But what many do not know, what the ancient priests and royal scribes intentionally omitted from their records, is that this was not simply a passage to eternal peace. It was a trial, a test, and for many pharaohs, a doorway to an eternity of torment. Pharaohs believed that in death they would become gods, joining Osiris and the other deities in the afterlife. But not all who passed through the ceremonial doors of their tombs were granted divine status. The ritual of burial, far from being a serene passage, was often a desperate struggle for immortality. The tombs were designed not just as resting places, but as prisons, meant to hold the pharaoh's soul within, to prevent it from ever escaping and wandering the earth as a restless spirit. And this containment was not always gentle. The burial process was long and complex, beginning with the embalming rituals, where the body was drained of its fluids and preserved with resins and oils. But beneath this process of physical preservation was something far darker. The Egyptians believed that in order for the pharaoh to truly transcend into the afterlife, his soul needed to be fully protected, trapped within the tomb, unable to escape. And it was this trapping that required the most terrifying of rituals, the ritual of containment. A ceremony performed in the deepest, most sacred chamber of the tomb. The ritual began with the pharaoh's body being placed in a sarcophagus made of the purest stone. But this was just the first step. The second step was the sealing of the two-man act of finality that would keep the pharaoh's soul locked within. The tomb's entrance was sealed with a heavy stone, carved with ancient spells designed to lock the soul inside. But this wasn't enough. To ensure that the pharaoh's spirit could not escape, his most trusted servants, his bodyguards, his attendants, and sometimes even his closest family would be sacrificed, their bodies placed within the tomb alongside him. These sacrifices were not just symbolic. They were part of a ritual believed to bind the pharaoh's soul to the tomb. It was said that the souls of these servants would serve the pharaoh in the afterlife, guiding him through the underworld, keeping him from wandering into chaos. However, there was a darker side to these rituals. The priests, who oversaw the final burial, were not only concerned with the pharaoh, a safe journey to the afterlife, they also feared the wrath of the gods if the pharaoh's soul was not properly contained. Thus, the tombs were often equipped with traps, meant to ensnare anyone who dared to disturb the pharaoh's final resting place. These traps, hidden within the walls or buried beneath the floor, were said to be capable of killing any intruder with a single step. But what is rarely spoken of is that the pharaoh himself was not entirely at rest within the tomb. The spirits of the servants trapped with him would sometimes return to the mortal realm, their souls restless and twisted, bound to the tomb for eternity, and their whispers, laden with anguish, would occasionally drift through the halls of the pyramid, echoing across the desert and into the ears of the living. The burial rituals were more than just a means of honoring the pharaoh. They were a mechanism of control, a way to ensure that the pharaoh's reign never truly ended. For as long as the tomb remained undisturbed, the pharaoh's power would persist in the afterlife, and his influence would continue to shape the world. But as with all things of power, there was a danger: the curse. For in every ritual, in every chant spoken by the priests, there was always the possibility that something would go wrong, that the containment would fail. And so it was with the great pharaoh Amenhotep IV, known to history as Akhenaten. His reign was marked by a radical departure from tradition. He rejected the polytheistic beliefs of his ancestors in favor of worshipping a single god, Aten, the sun disk. His obsession with this new faith was so consuming that it led him to defy the old gods and to abandon the capital of Thebes, founding a new city, Akhenaten, dedicated solely to Aten. But Akhenaten's religious reforms were not just political. They were spiritual, and they came with great cost. When Akhenaten died in 1336 BC, the rituals surrounding his burial were unlike any the ancient world had ever seen. His tomb, located in the Valley of the Kings, was a marvel of engineering, filled with inscriptions that glorified Aten above all else. But there was something off about the tomb, something that the priests refused to acknowledge. The tomb was too grand, too pristine, and the rites surrounding Akhenaten's burial were rushed, performed without the usual care and ceremony. Some believe that this haste, this lack of reverence, was the beginning of the curse. Akhenaten's tomb was sealed quickly, and the body was buried with a lavish array of treasures. But the real horror lay in the fact that his soul was not properly contained. Akhenaten in his arrogance had angered the gods, and in death he found himself lost. Wandering between the realms of life and death, his spirit could not rest, and his tomb became a prison of his own making. Over the centuries, many who attempted to disturb his tomb met untimely deaths. Scholars, thieves, even archaeologists each struck down by a curse that seemed to defy explanation. The tomb, long forgotten by the living, had become a place of silent suffering. What happened within the walls of Akhenaten's tomb has never been fully understood. But what is known is that the ancient priests of Egypt, those who had once served the pharaohs, feared what had been unleashed. The curse was not just the result of one man's defiance, it was a consequence of the very burial rituals that had been enacted to ensure immortality. The pharaohs were not merely passing into the afterlife. They were binding themselves to the tombs, and in doing so, they invited the wrath of the gods themselves. For centuries, Akhenaten's tomb lay undisturbed until the early 20th century, when British archaeologist Howard Carter stumbled upon the tomb of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's successor. The discovery of the tomb, filled with priceless treasures, captured the world's imagination. But what followed was a series of mysterious deaths, a trail of victims who had dared to disturb the resting place of the boy king. The so-called curse of the pharaohs became a sensational tale. But those who studied the ancient burial rituals of Egypt knew better. The curse was not simply a myth. It was the manifestation of a deeper, more profound power, the power of the pharaohs' burial rituals, which had bound them to the afterlife in ways no living person could ever comprehend. The power of the pharaohs' burial rituals lies not only in their ability to preserve the body, but in the way they ensured the pharaoh's soul remained within the tomb. This was the most sacred and most feared aspect of the burial process. The pharaoh was not just mummified and entombed. His soul was placed under a series of powerful enchantments, ensuring that no matter what happened in the physical world, he would remain as a force that influenced the living. At the center of this power was the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, prayers, and incantations designed to guide the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife. The book contained the key to the underworld, a roadmap for the soul to navigate the treacherous waters of the Duat, where it would face trials and judgment before finally reaching the afterlife. But it also held darker rituals, spells meant to protect the tomb and keep the pharaoh's soul bound to the earthly realm. These dark spells were not just meant to keep intruders out. They were designed to trap the pharaoh's essence, binding it to the tomb and ensuring that no one could ever disturb the sanctity of his resting place. The walls of the tomb, lined with inscriptions from the Book of the Dead, were a physical manifestation of this binding. The hieroglyphs themselves were charged with magical energy, each symbol a barrier that would hold the pharaoh's soul within. If anyone dared to break the seal, they would be struck down, their spirit forever entangled in the curse of the tomb. But as time passed, these tombs began to crumble. The sands of the desert shifted, and the tombs, once hidden from the world, became exposed. In this exposure, the spirits of the pharaohs began to stir. What followed was a series of deaths, unexplained accidents, and inexplicable misfortunes. The power of the pharaoh's burial rituals had not been lost to time, it had only grown stronger. And in the wrong hands, it could unleash a darkness that no one could control. The last pharaoh to be entombed in such a manner was Cleopatra VII, whose death in 30 BC marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last of the Egyptian monarchs. Cleopatra's tomb, though not as elaborate as those of her predecessors, was still steeped in the same dark rituals. But when her tomb was finally discovered in the 20th century, no curses were found, at least, none in the traditional sense. Instead, what lay buried with Cleopatra was not just her body, but the remnants of an ancient, forgotten power, the very power that had driven her ancestors to madness, the power of the burial rituals that had bound the pharaohs to the realm of the dead. The tomb of Cleopatra, like so many before it, remained untouched by time. But the rituals, the power of those who had gone before her, never truly died. The curse of the pharaohs remains. It lies dormant, waiting for those who seek to uncover its dark secrets.